Micah Ford had put a bullet in a rattlesnake at 40 yards, wrestled a steer twice his weight into the dirt, and ridden through a hailstorm that split fence posts clean in half. And in all 31 years of his life, he had never once been tender with anything. That was simply the truth of him, the same way the sky over Cutter's Creek was simply wide and pitiless and blue. His father had been a hard man, and his father's father before him, and the Ford men had passed that hardness down through the generations, the way other families passed down pocket watches or Bible names. Micah wore his hardness the way he wore his hat, low, settled, and without apology. He did not consider himself unkind. Unkind was a word for men who enjoyed cruelty. Micah did not enjoy anything particular. He simply moved through the world with the economy of a man who had learned early that softness was a debt the West collected on with interest. He ran the Double F Ranch 8 miles outside of Cutter's Creek, Texas, in the year 1878, and he ran it alone. Not alone in the sense that no one else lived there. He employed 4 ranch hands, a Mexican cook named Reuben who had been with the place longer than Micah himself had owned it, and a boy of 16 named Caleb who mucked stalls and carried water and asked far too many questions. But Micah was alone in the way that mattered. There was no woman in the main house, no fire lit in the parlor on Sunday evenings, no voice that called him in from the dark when he stayed too long on the porch. He had been engaged once to a girl from Abilene whose name he no longer said aloud, and she had left him with a letter that cited his coldness in 3 different paragraphs. He had read the letter twice, folded it precisely, and burned it in the fireplace. He had not been engaged since. Cutter's Creek was a proper town by 1878 standards, which is to say it had a general store, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office, a saloon with a piano player who knew 6 songs and played them endlessly in rotation, a church that was fuller on election days than on Sundays, and a hotel that had survived 2 fires and a flood and still listed slightly to the east. The town sat at the edge of the hill country, where the land was rough and beautiful in equal measure, all limestone outcroppings and cedar groves and creek beds that ran silver in the spring and went bone dry by August. It was not the kind of town that expected much to happen. And then Beatrice Langston arrived on the noon stage in July, and everything that Cutter's Creek had not expected began at once. She came with a single trunk, a hat box, a small leather satchel she clutched against her side as though it contained either money or something more valuable than money, and an expression on her face that Micah, who happened to be standing at the livery that morning collecting a repaired saddle, would later describe only as composed. Not happy, not frightened, composed, the way a person is composed when they have made a decision and are choosing not to second-guess it. He noticed her the way he noticed most things, without wanting to, because his eyes were trained to catch anything that moved differently than it should. She moved differently. She stepped off that stage and looked at Cutter's Creek straight on, without the polite half-glance that newcomers usually gave a town they were measuring without wanting to appear to be measuring it. She looked at it directly, the dusty Main Street, the leaning hotel, the sun hammering down on the wooden awnings, and she nodded once, as though she and the town had come to some private agreement. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, with a face that was not conventionally pretty in the way of the fashion plates Reuben's wife kept pasted above her kitchen shelf. She was something better than conventionally pretty. She had a jaw set with determination and hands that, Micah would later discover, knew how to do actual work, and eyes that watched everything with an attentiveness that some people found unsettling, because it made them feel that not much they said was going to go by unchallenged. Micah watched her for exactly 3 seconds, registered that she was a newcomer, and went back to checking the saddle's stitching. That was the extent of their first meeting. He did not introduce himself. She did not look his way. The noon stage pulled out, the dust settled, and Beatrice Langston walked into the hotel with her trunk being carried behind her and her chin at a particular angle that Micah, entirely against his will, noticed even with his back turned. He told himself it was the angle. It reminded him of something. He did not examine what. She had come to Cutter's Creek because she had taken a position as the new school teacher. The previous teacher, a Mr. Harold Penns, had accepted a position in Galveston, citing his lungs' preference for sea air, and the town had been 3 months without a teacher when the county board had sent word of Beatrice Langston's application. She was from Virginia originally, educated at a women's seminary in Richmond, and she had been teaching in a small town outside of San Antonio for 2 years before some disagreement with the school board there, the nature of which she did not volunteer, and the people of Cutter's Creek only partially pieced together over time, had sent her looking north and west for a new post. She settled into the hotel for the first week while the schoolhouse was aired out and whitewashed and given a new stove, and in that week she introduced herself to everyone in Cutter's Creek with a thoroughness that impressed even the most guarded of the townspeople. She called on the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Walt Devers who was honestly decent if a little slow to action. She introduced herself to Emmeline Pace, who ran the general store with her husband Joe and was the closest thing Cutter's Creek had to a social authority. She attended Sunday service at the church and shook every hand afterward. She visited the 3 families whose children would be her students and learned the names of those children before she had even set foot in the schoolroom. She also called on the Double F Ranch, because 2 of her students were the children of one of Micah's ranch hands, a widow named Clara Sutton, who had been left with a boy of 9 and a girl of 7 when her husband Frank had died of fever the previous winter. Clara lived in the small bungalow at the east end of the ranch that had been built for the head hand's family, and Micah had kept her on because she managed the chickens and the kitchen garden, and because he was not, whatever his coldness suggested, incapable of a practical compassion. Beatrice Langston arrived at the Double F on a Thursday morning in a borrowed wagon, driven by Joe Pace, who had various business out that direction anyway. Micah saw the wagon from the top pasture where he was repairing fence with his hands, and he watched it pull into the yard with the same narrowed attention he gave everything that came onto his property uninvited. He recognized Joe Pace. The woman beside Joe he identified as the new teacher from the hotel. He went back to the fence post and let Reuben handle it from the yard. But Reuben's wife, who was named Dolers and who was a more sociable person than anyone else on the property combined, came out of the kitchen and brought Beatrice Langston lemonade, and the conversation that followed on the shaded side porch reached Micah on the wind in fragments. Something about the children's reading level, something about a primer, laughter, actual warm laughter, from Dolers, who did not laugh easily. He came down from the pasture an hour later, not because of the laughter, but because a section of fence line on the south side had turned out to require a new post altogether, and he needed the second post driver from the equipment barn. He passed the side porch on his way. He did not intend to stop. Beatrice Langston was on her feet with a measuring tape in her hand, apparently measuring the porch railing for some reason that Dolers was explaining involved the children doing better when they had something to hold onto while they learned to read aloud, which made only partial sense to Micah, but apparently made complete sense to both women. She looked up when he passed. Their eyes met. She said, "Mr. Ford, I believe. I am Beatrice Langston. I have come to speak with Mrs. Sutton about her children." He stopped because it would have been actively rude not to. He said, "Mrs. Sutton is in the garden." Then he kept walking. There was a beat of silence behind him, and then he heard Dolers say something in a low voice and Beatrice say something back, and the 2 women continued their conversation. He collected the post driver and went back up the hill and told himself, quite firmly, that the new teacher was nothing to him. He almost managed to mean it. The schoolhouse opened in September, and within 2 weeks the entirety of Cutter's Creek had formed a strong opinion of Beatrice Langston. The parents thought she was excellent, possibly the best teacher the town had had, which was high praise given that some of them had been skeptical of a woman taking the post in the first place. The children thought she was stern but fair, which was the highest praise children gave teachers they actually respected. Emmeline Pace thought she was the most sensible woman to arrive in Cutter's Creek since Emmeline herself, which she said without irony. The piano player at the saloon, whose name was Tommy Reese, thought she was the prettiest woman he had seen since San Antonio, which he said with considerable irony given that he had never been to San Antonio. Micah thought about her more than he had intended to. This was not sentimental, he told himself. This was simply the nature of a small town. When a new person arrived and rearranged the landscape of the place even slightly, a man's mind catalogued it. It was no different from noting that the creek was running lower than usual this year, or that the south pasture needed new grass seed. It was observation. It was practical awareness. He saw her twice in October. The first time was at the general store, where they both happened to be on a Saturday morning. She was purchasing chalk and a quantity of paper and a bottle of ink, and she argued with Joe Pace about the price of the ink in a way that was so straightforward and businesslike that Joe, who did not typically lower prices for anyone, lowered the price. Micah watched this from the other side of the counter and felt something that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it. The second time was at the church on the Sunday after that, when the minister announced that the harvest social would be held the following month and asked for volunteers to organize it. 3 women raised their hands. Beatrice Langston raised her hand and then, before anyone else spoke, said that the social should be held in the afternoon rather than the evening because several families lived far enough out of town that an evening event meant a dangerous night ride home, and had anyone considered that? The minister looked somewhat taken aback. Emmeline Pace said she thought it was an excellent idea. The social was rescheduled for afternoon. After the service, Micah found himself standing near Beatrice in the loose crowd of people making their way out into the churchyard, and he said, without quite planning to, "The Kellerman family would have appreciated that. Their place is 12 miles north." She turned and looked at him. It was the most direct eye contact he could remember anyone giving him in some time. She said, "I know, I visited them last week. Their son Eli is one of my students. He's very bright. He deserved to come to a social without his parents worrying about the ride home." There was a pause. The crowd moved around them. He said, "That was practical thinking." She said, "I generally try to think practically." He was not sure why he said what he said next. He would not have been able to explain it if pressed. He said, "The Double F hosts the harvest meal for the hands and their families each year. You're welcome to attend." She studied him for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable sensation that she was reading him the way she probably read her students, looking not just at what was on the surface but at the structure underneath. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Ford. I will think on it." She came. She brought Clara Sutton's children and helped them with their plates, and she talked to Reuben about his cooking methods and to Dolers about the garden, and she sat at the long table in the yard with the ranch hands and their families, and did not once act as though the occasion was beneath her or above her, just exactly right for what it was. And when the food was done and the late afternoon light was going gold over the hills, she walked to where Micah was standing at the fence at the edge of the yard, and she stood beside him and looked out at the land. She said, "This is beautiful country." He said, "It is." She said, "You don't say much." He said, "No." She said, "That's all right. I sometimes say enough for 2 people." And he felt something shift in him, just slightly, like a door that had been settled hard in its frame for a very long time moving a single inch. It was so small a shift that he could pretend he had not felt it. He pretended he had not felt it. The months that followed were not dramatic in their outward form. Cutter's Creek continued to be Cutter's Creek, and Micah Ford continued to run his ranch with the same iron efficiency he always had, and Beatrice Langston continued to teach her students and attend church and argue practically with Joe Pace about prices. But the geometry between Micah and Beatrice changed. so gradually that neither of them could have identified the moment it began to change. It started with the fence. In November, a section of the fence line that ran closest to the road into town was taken down by a wagon whose driver had misjudged the turn in the dark, and the following morning 3 of Micah's cattle were in the road. He was out before dawn repairing it, and Beatrice Langston, who walked to the schoolhouse every morning at 7 because she was constitutionally incapable of being late, found him there in the gray cold light with the post driver and a look on his face that she later described to Clara Sutton as being equal parts fury and concentration. She stopped. She said, "Is there anything I can do to help?" He said without looking up. "No," she said. "I can hold the post while you drive it." "You'll set it straighter with someone holding it." He looked up then. She was wearing a gray wool coat and her dark hair was pinned up under a sensible hat, and she was holding her leather satchel under one arm and looking at him with a complete absence of any particular emotion, neither pleading nor challenging, just offering a practical fact. He said after a moment, "Hold it here." She held the post. He drove it. It was straighter than any post he had set in years, not because she was holding it differently than a person could hold it alone, but because he had found himself paying attention in a way he usually did not when it was only himself and the work. He thanked her afterward in the shortest possible way, and she nodded and went on her way to the schoolhouse, and he finished the fence and went back to the ranch and spent the morning being more brusque with his hands than usual, which they attributed to the aggravation of the damaged fence and left alone. December brought cold, and Micah began making a habit of passing through town more often than he had any particular business to. He told himself there were reasons. He needed feed from Pace's store. He needed to check in with Walt Devers about the property line dispute with his neighbor to the west, a man named Garrett who ran sheep, and about whom Micah had several opinions. He needed to stop by the telegraph office on account of a wire he was expecting from a cattle buyer in Abilene. These were all true things, and they were all also covers for the fact that the schoolhouse was on the main street, and at noon on school days Beatrice Langston came out onto the small front step to ring the bell for lunch recess, and he had developed an awareness of this timing that he did not examine closely. They talked, when their paths crossed, with an increasing ease that surprised him. She asked real questions and expected real answers, which was different from the way most people talked to him, circling whatever they actually wanted to say with enough social cushioning that nothing sharp ever got through. She asked him how he had come to own the Double F, and he told her, more plainly than he had told anyone, that his father had given him his mother's inheritance money and told him to do something with it, and he had bought the place from a man who was moving to Colorado and not looking back, and he had spent 7 years turning it into something that could sustain itself in bad years as well as good. She listened without interrupting. She said, "You must have been very young when you started." He said, 24. She said, "The same age I am now." He said, "You're doing all right." She looked at him and the corner of her mouth moved, and he realized with a start that he had just said something that could be construed as a compliment, and she knew it. She said, "So are you, Mr. Ford," and she went back inside her schoolhouse. He stood in the street for a moment afterward, a bag of grain meal over his shoulder, feeling foolish and oddly warm, which was not a usual combination for him. January of 1879 came in hard, as it sometimes did in the hill country, with a week of sleet that glazed the roads and brought business in town to a near standstill. Micah stayed on the ranch during the worst of it, managing the animals through the cold with the focused, grim efficiency that such weather demanded, and he did not see Beatrice for 10 days. When the sleet broke and he came into town for the first time since it had started, he found himself looking for her before he had consciously decided to do so. He spotted her outside the general store, loading a small parcel into her borrowed wagon, and he crossed the street. He said, "How did the schoolhouse fare in the cold?" She said, "The stove is inadequate. I submitted a request to the school board in October for a larger one. They have not acted on it." He said, "Who's on the board?" She named 3 men. He knew all three. Two of them were the kind of men who moved slowly on anything that cost money and faster on anything that imposed control, and he had clashed with both of them at various town meetings. He said, "I'll speak to Devers. He has some influence with Barrett." She stopped loading the parcel and looked at him directly, which was something she did often enough now that he was beginning to find it less unsettling and more simply honest. She said, "Why would you do that?" He said, "Because it's cold and children shouldn't be cold in school." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Micah." It was the first time she had used his name. Not Mr. Ford, just Micah, plain and undecorated, as though she had the right to it, which she did not technically by any convention of the time. He felt it land somewhere in the middle of his chest like a stone dropped into still water. He said with difficulty, "You're welcome, Beatrice." He spoke to Devers. Devers spoke to Barrett. By the end of February, the schoolhouse had a new stove. He still had not been tender with anything. He had been useful, and he had been present, and he had noticed her with a thoroughness that was beginning to alarm him in his more honest moments. But there was a difference between that and tenderness. Tenderness required something he did not know how to reach. It required opening something that had been shut for so long that he had genuinely come to believe the door no longer existed. March brought trouble, and not the slow, quiet kind. The Garrett situation, the sheep rancher on Micah's western property line, had been simmering all winter. Garrett's sheep were crossing onto the Double F regularly, which was bad for the cattle and worse for the grass, and Garrett was disinclined to acknowledge the problem, because he was disinclined to acknowledge anything he did not want to acknowledge. He was the sort of man who used pleasantness as a weapon, all smiles and shrugs, and the smiles and shrugs had been hiding, it turned out, an active plan to contest the property line with a claim that predated Micah's deed. The claim was fraudulent. Micah's lawyer in Austin confirmed this within a week of receiving the documents, but fraudulent claims took time to resolve. And in the meantime, Garrett's men were more aggressive about the crossings, and there was a general tension along the western fence that kept Micah's hands edgy, and kept Micah himself spending more time at the fence line and less time anywhere else. It was at the western fence line, in the third week of March, that Beatrice Langston managed to get herself injured. She had come out to the ranch on a Saturday to visit Clara Sutton and the children, as she had begun to do on some Saturdays, and Clara had mentioned that the plum thicket at the edge of the western pasture was in early bloom and worth seeing, because it was a genuinely remarkable sight, that thicket in bloom, white flowers against the pale limestone of the hillside. Beatrice had walked out alone, following the creek path as Clara directed her, while Clara stayed with the children. What Clara had not mentioned, because she did not know it, was that Garrett's men had been pushing cattle along the western fence that morning, and the cattle had spooked at something, a rabbit, a shadow, the wind off the hill, and broken through the fence in 2 places. 15 head of Garrett's cattle were now loose in Micah's western pasture, and 3 of Micah's hands were out driving them back, and the fence was down in irregular sections across the path that Beatrice was walking. She came around the curve of the creek path and found a gap in the fence, and not knowing what it signified, stepped through it. And that was when she encountered the downed section on the far side, where the wire had pulled and coiled back and lay in the grass half hidden by the spring growth, and her foot caught in it, and she went down. She went down hard, the way a person goes down when they are moving at a normal walking pace, and then suddenly are not moving at all. A full-length fall with no time to catch herself properly. She put her hand out, and her hand caught on a piece of barbed wire from the second section as it gave way, and there was a cut across her palm that was serious enough to bleed heavily, and her ankle, which had been caught in the coiled wire, was wrenched badly, not broken, as it turned out, but badly twisted, and she could not stand on it when she tried. She sat in the spring grass in Micah Ford's western pasture with a bleeding hand and an ankle she could not stand on, and she was not, in the first moments, frightened. She was annoyed at herself, and then she was practical, and then she assessed the situation, and then she understood that she was a quarter mile from the nearest building with an injury that would not let her walk, and she called out. She called out in the direction she had come from, toward the ranch, and her voice carried well in the clear March air, but the hands were on the other side of the pasture and the sound went wrong. She waited. It was Micah who found her. He had been coming along the fence line from the north, checking the sections his men had reported down, moving with the rapid, purposeful stride of a man attending to a problem, and he came around the limestone outcropping that jutted into the pasture on the western side and stopped. She was sitting in the grass about 30 yards away. He could see from where he stood that she was down, that she was not moving, and that there was something wrong. He crossed the distance between them at a pace that was not quite running, but was very close to it, and he arrived at her side and dropped to one knee and looked at her. Her face was pale, and she had her bleeding hand pressed against her coat, which was a practical response and was already turning the gray wool dark, and her right ankle was at an angle that told him the story without her needing to speak it. She looked up at him, and her composure was intact, but he could see at its edges the particular thinning that composure got when a person had been frightened alone for too long. She said, "I walked into the wire. My hand is cut and my ankle is twisted. I cannot stand on it." He said nothing. He was already looking at her hand, and he reached for it without thinking, and she let him take it, and he turned it over carefully in both of his, and the cut was long, across the meat of the palm below the thumb, and it was bleeding more than he would have liked. He had no cloth on him. His hands were gloved. His jacket had no kerchief. He pulled his bandana from around his neck and wrapped it around her hand with a care and a steadiness that neither of them commented on. Then he looked at her ankle. He did not touch it yet. He said, "Can you move it?" She moved it just slightly, and the pain crossed her face clearly, though she made no sound. He said, "It's not broken." "But we're not walking out of here," she said. "I gathered that." He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at him, and something passed between them that was not words. He said, "I'm going to carry you." She said simply, "All right." He had carried injured things before, calves that had gotten into trouble, a dog once that had been struck by a horse. He had done it with the practical economy with which he did everything efficient, without waste, getting the job done. He had not been tender about it. He slid one arm under her knees and one arm behind her back and lifted her, and she put her arm around his neck because that was the practical thing to do, and he began walking toward the ranch, and somewhere in the first 10 steps, something happened to him that he did not have words for and would not have words for quite some time. He was aware of how light she was. Not fragile, she was not a fragile woman. He had known that from the first morning she had helped him with the fence post, but real in a way that undid him. Real and warm and close, and her head was near his shoulder, and he could feel that she was holding herself carefully, trying not to put undue weight on him, trying not to be a burden even when she was injured, even when she was being carried across a pasture with a cut hand and a twisted ankle. She was trying not to be difficult, and for reasons he could not have explained, that undid him more than anything else. He adjusted his hold on her. He made sure his arm under her knees was firm enough that she didn't have to work to balance. He slowed his pace just slightly to smooth out the gait. He did not think about what he was doing. He was not conscious of it as a choice. His hands simply knew somehow what to do, and what they did was gentle and it was tender, and it was the first time in 31 years that his hands had known how to do that. She said quietly against his shoulder, "I'm sorry about this." He said, "Don't be." She said, "Your hands, when you wrap the bandana, you have very steady hands." He said nothing to that. He kept walking. She said, "You were frightened when you saw me." He kept his eyes on the path. He said, "I don't get frightened." She said after a pause, "All right." She did not argue it. She simply went quiet, and he carried her, and the March wind moved across the pasture, and the plum thicket was blooming white on the hillside above them. And Micah Ford carried Beatrice Langston across his land with more gentleness than he had known he had, and the door that had been sealed in him moved more than an inch this time. He brought her into the main house, which was not where he had intended to bring her. He had thought to take her to Doller's in the kitchen, who was the most naturally capable person on the property in any situation involving an injury. But the kitchen was too far and the front room was right there, and he brought her to the settle in the front room and set her down with the same practiced care with which he had carried her, and he stood back. She looked around the front room. It was spare and clean, the way everything Micah kept was spare and clean, but there was no warmth in it, no ornamentation, nothing that spoke of a life that was anything other than functional. She said nothing about this. She looked at him and said, "Do you have anything for the hand? I should keep pressure on it." He went to the bedroom for the cloth he kept in the kit under the bed, and when he came back she had unwrapped the bandana and was looking at the cut with a clinical assessment that reminded him, oddly, of the way she had looked at Cutter's Creek that first day off the stage. He knelt beside her and took her hand again, and he cleaned the cut with water and carbolic from the kit, and his hands were the steadiest they had been at any task in his recent memory. She said, while he worked, "How bad is it really?" He said, "It will need to close on its own. It's long but not deep. If you keep it clean, it will heal clean." She said, "Have you done this before, treated injuries?" He said, "Ranching means injuries. You learn," she said. "You're very good at this." He looked up at her. She was watching him with those direct, attentive eyes, and there was something in them that was different from her usual composed assessment, something softer, something that was working through what had just happened and arriving at conclusions she had not expected. He looked away and continued wrapping her hand. He sent Caleb for Doc Hennessy, the town's physician, who arrived within the hour and confirmed what Micah had assessed. The hand would heal without stitching if cared for properly, and the ankle was a severe sprain that needed rest and binding and no wait for at minimum 2 weeks. Doc Hennessy bound the ankle with an efficiency that Micah watched carefully and filed away, and then he looked at Micah and said, "She shouldn't walk out to that wagon. You want I should bring a conveyance?" Beatrice said, "I can manage," Micah said. "She's staying in the spare room until she can walk." He said it the way he said everything, flat and certain, as if it had already been decided and the remaining steps were administrative. Then he looked at Beatrice, and something passed across his face that was not the flat certainty of a moment before, it was a question or something close to it. He said, "If you're willing." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "I am willing." Clara Sutton came to the main house and sat with Beatrice through the afternoon, and Doller's brought food, and Caleb went back to town to collect Beatrice's things from the hotel with a note to Emmeline Pace explaining the situation, because Emmeline Pace was the sort of person who would need to know, and it was better for her to know accurately than inaccurately. By evening, Beatrice Langston was installed in the spare room of Micah Ford's main house with her trunk and her satchel and her hatbox, and the ranch had absorbed this arrangement with a naturalness that surprised its owner. Micah sat on the porch that night after everyone had gone to their places, and he looked out at the dark pasture and the pale limestone hill and the early stars coming up over the cedar ridge, and he tried to understand what had happened to him out there in the grass. He had not been tender with anything in 31 years. He knew this about himself. He had known it so long that it had ceased to be something he thought about and had simply become something he was, like being right-handed, like being taller than most men, like having his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. It was a fact of him. And in an afternoon, a single afternoon, carrying a woman across a pasture with a cut hand and a twisted ankle, it had turned out not to be a fact at all. It had turned out to be a door. He sat with that for a long time. He was not a man who rushed his conclusions. The 2 weeks of Beatrice's recovery were the strangest 2 weeks of Micah Ford's life, which had not previously been short on strangeness. She was not a passive patient. By the second day, she had arranged for Clara to bring a supply of marking work from the schoolhouse. She had left detailed instructions for Emmeline Pace's eldest daughter, a capable girl of 17, who was helping with the younger students in her absence. And she was working through the assignments at the table in the spare room with the red ink pen she apparently carried in the leather satchel at all times. By the third day, she had begun coming out to the table in the main room for her meals, rather than having them brought to her, hauling herself on the crutch that Doc Hennessy had sent out. And by the fourth day, she was at the main table for every meal. Micah was at the table too because it was his table. There had not been a woman at his table in 7 years. The arrangement created a new rhythm in the house that he could feel as clearly as he felt a change in the wind's direction, not uncomfortable, which was the part that alarmed him, but natural, which was the part that alarmed him more. They talked at dinner. Real talking, the kind that went beyond the courtesies of the general store and the church steps, the kind that required opinions and willingness to be disagreed with. She told him about Virginia, about the seminary, about the disagreement in San Antonio, which she now disclosed more fully. She had insisted on teaching the children of the Mexican families who lived at the edge of town alongside the white children, had been told this was not done, had done it anyway, and had been dismissed. He listened to this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Good." She said, "Excuse me." He said, "You were right, and you didn't back down. Good." She looked at him in a way that she had not looked at him before, something that was surprised and moved in equal measure, and she said, "Most people don't say that." He said, "Most people are wrong." On the 5th evening, he built a fire in the parlor fireplace, which he had not done in years. He told himself it was because the March nights were still cold enough to warrant it, and the spare room shared a wall with the parlor. He sat in the chair by the fire after dinner with the account ledger he had been working through, and Beatrice came and sat on the settle with her marking work, and they were in the same room in the firelight without either of them having suggested it or named it as a thing. He looked up from the ledger at one point and found her looking at him. She did not look away when he caught her. She said, "You were frightened when you found me." "I told you I don't get frightened," she said, "and I said all right, but I don't believe it was all right. I think you were frightened, and I think it surprised you, and I think you're still thinking about it." He put the ledger down. He looked at her across the fire. He said, "You ask very direct questions." She said, "I'm not asking, I'm telling you what I observed." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. He said, "You were sitting in the grass and you were bleeding and you couldn't stand up." "That's not a situation a person enjoys coming across," she said. "No, but the way you looked at me, that was more than situational concern." He said, "Beatrice." She said, "Yes." He said, "Don't push this." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not pushing anything, Micah. I'm just not pretending I don't see what I see." And she went back to her marking work and he went back to his ledger, and neither of them said anything else that night. But the fire burned for 2 hours, and neither of them suggested leaving. On the 7th day, he came into the kitchen at dawn to find her already there, standing at the window with a cup of coffee Dolores had left, watching the light come up over the eastern ridge. Her hair was down. He had not seen her hair down before, and it was dark and long and slightly disarranged from sleep, and she was wearing a dressing gown and she was barefoot on the kitchen floor, and she looked completely unaware that she was standing in his kitchen in the early light looking like something that had always belonged there. He stopped in the doorway. She heard him and turned, and she started slightly, and then she said with a composure that was impressive given that she was clearly surprised, "Good morning." Dolores left coffee. He said, "I see that." He went to the coffee and poured himself a cup and stood beside her at the window, because there was nowhere else in the kitchen that had an adequate view of the morning coming in, and they stood side by side and watched the light change. And he was aware with every nerve he had that she was close to him, and that her hair was down, and that he had never in his life wanted to say something, and not known how to say it as much as he wanted to say something, and did not know how to say it right now. He said eventually, "The plum thicket is still blooming, I expect. You should see it when you can walk." She turned her head and looked at him sideways, and the morning light was in her eyes, and she said, "I would like that." On the 12th day, Garrett's men came to the property line again, this time with a survey crew and a lawyer, and the lawyer presented a piece of paper that claimed to revise the property boundary in Garrett's favor by half a mile. Micah went to the fence line with his own lawyer. a careful man named Aldridge who had ridden out from Careville when Micah telegraphed him, and they spent 3 hours at the fence with the survey crew, and it was not a physical confrontation, but it was a tense one, and the surveyor from Garrett's side made a measurement error that Micah caught and pointed out without raising his voice, and Garrett's lawyer backed down by 3 inches from threatening at a time. And in the end, no agreement was reached, but Garrett's claim was weakened. Micah came back to the house in the mid-afternoon, dusty and tired, and Beatrice was at the main table with a letter she was writing to the county school board regarding the curriculum for the following year. She looked up when he came in and read his face and said, "The Garrett business," he said, "still unresolved, but they know their claim is thin." She said, "Sit down." He said, "I need to check on the hands." She said, "In 10 minutes, sit down, Micah." He sat down, and she went to the kitchen and came back with cold coffee and a plate of cornbread that Dolers had left, and she set them in front of him and sat down across from him and watched him eat with an expression that was neither pitying nor performatively caring but simply attentive, simply present. And he ate the cornbread and drank the cold coffee and felt the tension of the afternoon drain out of his shoulders with a slowness that he found, when he noticed it, bewildering. He said, "You're not supposed to be waiting on me. You're the injured one," she said. "I can walk if I'm careful, and you look like you needed someone to tell you to sit down." He said, "Do I look like someone who gets told to sit down?" She said, "You look like someone who has never in his life had anyone to tell him, which is different from looking like someone who doesn't need it." He looked at her across the table. He said very quietly, "Beatrice." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't know what to do with you." She said, "I'm not sure I follow your meaning." He said, "You're in my house. You've been in my house for 12 days. You're at my table. You're in my kitchen in the morning. You talk to me like you." He stopped. He put the coffee cup down. He said, "I have managed this place alone for 7 years. I have been alone for a long time before that. And I know how to do that. I know how to do that very well. And right now I don't know how to do it at all, and I'm not sure if that frightens me or not." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You said you don't get frightened." He said, "I know what I said." She folded her hands on the table. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly and without evasion, and she said, "I came to Cutter's Creek to teach school. I came because I had been run out of one town for doing what I thought was right, and I wanted a new place and a clean start. I did not come looking for anything else." She paused. "But I find that I am looking for something else now. I didn't expect that. And I think you didn't expect any of this either. But I'm not a person who pretends not to see what I see, and what I see is that you have been good to me and careful with me, and that those things came from somewhere in you that you didn't know was there." She met his eyes. "I think you know it too." He said after a long moment, "You see a great deal." She said, "Teachers generally do." He said, "What do you see when you look at me?" She considered this seriously because she was a serious person. She said, "I see a man who is very hard on the outside because he had to be, and who is not nearly as hard on the inside as he has arranged for people to believe, and who is frightened, yes, frightened. Don't argue with me of what it costs to let anyone know the difference." The room was very quiet. He could hear the wind outside, and somewhere a horse moved in the corral and the fire in the kitchen stove ticked. He said, "That's a remarkably accurate accounting." She said, "I'm generally accurate." He said, "I know." He looked at her hand, where the bandana wrap had been replaced by a proper bandage, and the cut was healing the way he had said it would, clean and slow. He said, "When you're well enough to walk to the thicket, I'll take you." She understood that this was not about the thicket. She said, "I know you will." On the 14th day, Doc Hennessy came back and pronounced the ankle sufficiently healed for careful walking, and on the 15th morning, Micah Ford walked with Beatrice Langston up the creek path to the western pasture, and the fence had been repaired, and they went through the proper gate this time, and the plum thicket was still faintly in bloom, the last of the white flowers persistent on the branches, and the limestone hillside was warm in the April light. And she stood at the edge of the thicket and looked at it and said nothing for a long time. He stood beside her. He was aware that they had been walking side by side and that their hands had been very close and that he had been aware of the proximity of her hand with every step they took, and that he had not done anything about it, and that he wanted to. He took her hand. He took it carefully because the cut was still healing, and he turned her hand up and looked at the scar forming across the palm, and then he did not release it. He held it and she looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and he said, "I want to say something," she said. "Then say it," he said. "I am not good at this. I want you to know that at the outset so you are not surprised by it later." She said, "Good at what?" He said, "Any of this, all of this." He looked at their hands. "My whole life I have been hard. I was raised hard and I have lived hard and I have kept everything at the length of an arm because that was how I knew how to do it. And then you fell in your pasture," she said softly. "Your pasture." He said, "My pasture. And I picked you up and I carried you, and I didn't know where it came from, what I felt in my hands when I was carrying you. I have carried calves and I have carried a grown man after a fall, and I have never felt anything except the weight and the work. And you, I felt something different, and I haven't been able to put it down since." She said, "What did you feel?" He said, "I don't have a name for it." He looked at her. "But I want to find out what it is with you, if you are willing." She looked at him for a long time, and the April wind moved through the plum blossoms and sent a few of the last petals down around them, white against the pale limestone, and she said, "I am willing, Micah. I have been willing for some time." He leaned toward her, and she did not move away, and he kissed her, right there at the edge of the plum thicket, with the careful, steady reverence of a man doing something for the first time. And she kissed him back with the quiet certainty of a woman who had known for longer than he had that this was coming. They walked back down the creek path still holding hands, and the tenderness that he had not known he had moved through him like water finding a level, settling into all the places inside him that had been dry for too long. The spring and summer that followed were the fullest months of Micah Ford's life. He would not have described them in those terms. He was not, by nature, given to describing any of his experience in lyrical terms, but they were full in the way that a life becomes full when someone else is in it, who actually occupies the space they take up, who is present in the way that changes the quality of the air in a room. He courted her in the manner of the time and place, which is to say he was visible in his attentiveness, without being demonstrative about it beyond what the conventions of Cutter's Creek allowed. He called at the schoolhouse. He drove her to church on Sundays. He sat at the far end of the town social in May with a glass of lemonade, and watched her organize the children's games with the focused competence she brought to everything, and felt something in him so warm and plain that he almost didn't recognize it as happiness. They argued, too, because both of them were opinionated, and neither of them was constitutionally capable of leaving a disagreement unaddressed. They argued about the school board's decision to limit the curriculum to reading and arithmetic without history or geography, and Beatrice argued her case and then appealed to the board and then wrote to the county office. And she did all of this without asking his opinion but told him about it each time as though reporting the movements of a campaign. He said, when she had won the argument with the county office, "I never doubted you." She said, "Yes, you did. You thought the geography argument was too complicated for Devers to follow." He said, "That's not doubting you, that's doubting Devers." She said, "There is a difference, I'll grant." They argued about the Garrett situation, which had moved into formal legal proceedings by June, and Micah's position was that he wanted it settled by a judge, and Beatrice's position was that it could be settled without a judge if someone would talk to Garrett directly and find out what he actually wanted, because in her experience men like Garrett were fighting for something that wasn't the land itself. Micah said, "You don't know men like Garrett." She said, "I know that the land claim is fraudulent, which means he can't win in court, which means whatever he actually wants is something he can't get by winning in court, which means something else is driving this." Micah was silent for a moment. He said, "What do you think it is?" She said, "The creek access on the south boundary." His sheep need water, and the south boundary is the only place where the creek is reliable. He stared at her. He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I asked Clara, who asked Frank Sutton's brother-in-law who had worked for Garrett 3 years ago." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "A water access easement." She said, "A clearly defined, legally documented, non-transferable water access easement, which costs you nothing important and resolves the whole mess." He said, "You are a remarkable woman." She said, "I know. Will you talk to Garrett?" He talked to Garrett. It took 2 meetings and considerable restraint on Micah's part, because Garrett was the kind of man who required handling. But in the end they reached an agreement that Aldridge drew up in formal language, and the property line dispute was resolved by August. And Garrett's sheep had legal water access on the south boundary, and Micah's western fence was secure and uncontested. He came back from the second meeting and told Beatrice, and she looked at him with an expression of satisfaction that was the most beautiful thing he had thought about anyone looking since he could remember. He told her so. It came out plainer than he intended it, but she seemed to understand that plain was how he expressed things, and that plain from him was more than ornate from most men. She said, "You're going to have to practice compliments, Micah. You are not naturally gifted at them." He said, "I'll work on it." She said, "I know you will." In September, on the first anniversary of Beatrice's arrival in Cutter's Creek, Micah Ford asked her to marry him. He did it without preparation, which is to say he had been preparing for 3 months, but it came out without preamble, in the parlor where they had spent so many evenings, she with her work and he with his accounts, in the firelight that he now built every evening regardless of the temperature, because he had found that he liked the light it made and the way she looked in it. He set down his accounts. He said, "Beatrice." She set down her pen. She said, "Yes." He said, "I want to marry you." She looked at him. A smile moved across her face, slow and real and without any of the performance that smiles sometimes had. She said, "Is that a question?" He said, "It's both." "It's a question and a statement. Will you?" She said, "Yes, Micah, I will." He crossed the room and he sat beside her on the settle, and he took both her hands in his and he said, "I should tell you that I am not going to transform into someone I'm not. I am who I am. I am going to be difficult sometimes and quiet when I ought to talk, and certain about things I might be wrong about." She said, "I know that," he said, "and I should tell you that He stopped. The fire ticked. He said that what I feel for you is the truest thing I've felt. I don't have prettier words than that." She said, "I don't need prettier words than that." He said, "Good." She said, "Micah." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have been the finest surprise of my life." He kissed her then, and she returned it, and the parlor fire burned, and outside the Texas night was wide and full of stars, and Micah Ford held Beatrice Langston's hands and understood, finally, that the tenderness he had not known he had was not something that had come into him from outside. It had been there all along, under everything, waiting for the right pair of hands to need it. They were married in November of 1879, on a Saturday afternoon in the Cutter's Creek Church, in a ceremony that was simple and real, and attended by every person in town, because everyone had been watching this courtship, with the particular investment that small towns give to the romances they feel they have a stake in. Emmeline Pace cried, which surprised the pastor and did not surprise anyone who knew Emmeline. Clara Sutton brought both children, and the boy sat through the whole ceremony with a seriousness that Beatrice had clearly imparted to him through 9 months of schooling, and the girl fell asleep against Clara's arm and woke up when the church bells rang. Tommy Reese played the piano at the gathering afterward and played 7 songs instead of 6, because Beatrice had asked him to learn a 7th and given him the sheet music in September in anticipation of this occasion, which was the sort of planning ahead that was entirely consistent with her character. Reuben and Dollars made a meal that people talked about for years. Caleb, who was now 17 and growing rapidly in the direction of a capable ranch hand, spent the celebration in the corner with the red-cheeked expression of a boy who was trying very hard not to cry and not quite succeeding. Micah stood beside Beatrice through the whole celebration and said less than anyone else and meant more by it than anyone else. And when the gathering finally ended and they drove home in the wagon under the November stars, he reached over and took her hand, and they rode in silence the 8 miles back to the Double F, and the silence was full of everything that did not need to be said. The first winter of their marriage was cold and good. The house was different. Beatrice had not dramatically altered it. She was not a dramatic person about material things, but she had added to it in ways that accumulated. A rag rug in the front room that she made herself over 3 evenings, a curtain at the kitchen window in a blue cotton that she had chosen because it was exactly the color of the early morning sky, and she liked looking at something that color when she was having her first coffee of the day. A shelf of books in the parlor, which Micah added to at Christmas with 3 volumes he had ordered from Austin specifically, because she had mentioned them in a conversation 4 months earlier, and he had written the titles down immediately, and then carried the paper in his shirt pocket until he could get to the telegraph office. She opened the books on Christmas morning and looked at him, and he was loading wood into the fireplace and not looking at her, and she said, "Micah." He said, without turning, "Yes." She said, "You remembered." He said, "I wrote it down." She said, "Come here." He came, and she took his face in both hands, the one with the faint white scar across the palm and the other one, and she looked at him, and she said, "I love you." He had known it. He had felt it for months in the way she was present with him, in the way she told him hard truths without cruelty and easy ones without flattery, and looked at him with the consistency of a person who had made a choice and did not regret it. But it was different hearing it said plainly and directly, which was how she did everything, and he felt it somewhere deep in him, in the place that had been closed the longest. He said, "I love you, Beatrice." And then he said, "I didn't know there was this in me. I want you to know that. I didn't know any of this was possible for me." She said, "I knew." He said, "Of course you did." She said, "Don't be exasperated about it." He said, "I'm not exasperated. I'm grateful." She kissed him, and the fire was going now, and the blue curtain was in the kitchen window, and outside the Texas winter was cold and silver gray, and the Double F was warm. Beatrice continued teaching through the spring, because she had students, and she was not the kind of person who walked away from a responsibility. She had an arrangement with the school board, one of the few school boards in that part of Texas that allowed a married woman to teach, which she had negotiated with the same businesslike clarity with which she negotiated everything. And she taught through April, and when she understood in late spring that she was pregnant, she finished the term and then turned the classroom over to a new teacher, a young man named George Whitmore, who had come recommended by the county, and whom she spent 2 full weeks preparing with meticulous thoroughness. The pregnancy was not easy in the early months, which she bore with a composure that he found both admirable and alarming. She did not complain, which meant that he had to learn to read her in the ways she didn't speak, the particular stillness she went to when she was not feeling well, the slight adjustment of her breathing when something was worse than she wanted to indicate. He learned these things with the same attention he had always given everything that mattered, which was to say completely. He was with her through all of it. He rearranged his schedule to be closer to the house in the mornings when the sickness was worst. He learned to make the single thing that she could tolerate in the early weeks, a particular plain broth that dolers had told him about, and he made it without being asked and left it in the kitchen before he went out to work and came back to check on her at midday, every day, without exception. She said one afternoon when she was 6 months along and the early difficulties were behind her, and she was sitting in the front room with the afternoon light on her face, reading one of the books he had given her at Christmas, "You are going to be a wonderful father." He was at the doorway. He said, "What makes you say that?" She said, "You take care of things. You have always taken care of things. You just have to be shown what needs it." He came into the room and sat beside her, and she turned toward him, and he put his hand against the roundness of her belly, with the particular careful steadiness that his hands had found the first time he had wrapped her cut palm, and he felt the baby move under his hand, and the wonder of it moved through him clean and complete, and he said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. She put her hand over his and said nothing either. In September of 1880, their son was born. The labor was long, and Micah spent the night of it in a state of fear that he did not try to deny, pacing the yard and the porch and coming back to the bedroom door and being turned away by dolers and Doc Hennessy until the dawn came. And then the cry of a new voice, thin and outraged, cut through the morning air, and he stopped pacing and stood still. Doc Hennessy opened the door and said, "You have a son, Micah, and Beatrice is fine." He went in, and Beatrice was pale and exhausted and radiant in the way that women are sometimes radiant immediately after a great labor, the glow of having done something enormous, and she was holding the baby, and the baby was red and small and furious with the world in the way that new things are furious, and she looked up at Micah and said, "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same careful steadiness he had held her injured hand in the western pasture, and the baby was so small and so real and so present, and Micah Ford, who had not cried since his mother's funeral at the age of 11, felt his eyes blur and did not try to prevent it. He said, "Hello." He said it to the baby quietly as if it were a private greeting. Beatrice said, "What shall we call him?" He said, "I thought James, if you agree." She said, "James Ford, yes." James Ford was a healthy baby and a strong one, and the double F absorbed him as naturally as it had absorbed Beatrice, the whole ranch rearranging itself slightly around the fact of this new person. Caleb, who was now 18 and fully a ranch hand in all capacities, was the first to hold the baby after Micah and Beatrice and Dolers, and he held James with an expression of such terrified tenderness that Beatrice told Micah afterward it was the most endearing thing she had ever seen. Micah said, "Don't tell Caleb that, he'll be embarrassed." Beatrice said, "I know, that's why I'm telling you." James grew. He was, from the earliest stages, a child who was watching everything, which Beatrice said was clearly her influence, and Micah said was clearly because the ranch provided a great deal to watch, and they were both probably right. He was walking by 11 months and asking questions by the time he could form them, which was early, and by the age of 3 he was following his father around the ranch with a focused attention that Micah found, though he would not have admitted this in company, the most profound experience of his daily life. Micah taught his son the way he had done everything before Beatrice directly, without excess, trusting the child's capacity. But Beatrice's presence had changed how he taught as much as it had changed everything else. He was patient in a way he had never been patient before, because patience, he had discovered through her, was not weakness. It was the opposite. It was the confidence to let things take their proper time. She was still teaching in her way. Not at the schoolhouse. George Whitmore had settled into the position capably, but she had begun giving lessons to the ranch children informally on Saturday mornings, at the long table in the kitchen, and 3 families from neighboring properties had begun sending their children too. And by 1882, what had started as a Saturday kitchen table had become a proper subscription school that met 4 mornings a week in a room that Micah had added onto the east end of the house specifically for it. He had built it himself, with Caleb's help and Reuben's son, who was 17 and capable, and he had built it the way he built everything: solid, well-joined, meant to last. When it was done, he showed it to Beatrice, and she walked through it and ran her hand along the shelving and looked at the windows. He had put in good windows, south-facing, because she had mentioned once that good light was essential for reading, and she turned to him and said, "Micah, this is exactly right." He said, "You told me once that you think practically. I try to think practically about it." She put her hands on either side of his face, the way she had done on Christmas morning, and she looked at him, and she said, "You think practically about everything I need before I have finished thinking about it myself. Do you know how remarkable that is?" He said, "I know what you need because I pay attention to you." She said, "Most people do not pay attention the way you do." He said, "Most people have more to look at. I only have eyes for you." He said it without any particular dramatic intention, simply as a statement of literal fact, and she looked at him for a moment and then she laughed, a full, real, delighted laugh that he had come to treasure in the years of their marriage the way he treasured nothing else, and she said, "Micah Ford, you are romantic and you do not even know you're doing it." He said, "Is that a complaint?" She said, "It is the furthest possible thing from a complaint." The school grew. By 1883, she had 14 students and 2 days a week of older students who were working through a proper curriculum she had designed herself, drawing on everything she had learned at the seminary and everything she had learned in the years since. The county school board, the same body that had once told her women of her profession should limit their ambitions to the younger grades, sent a representative out to the F in the spring of 1883 and observed a Thursday morning class, and told Beatrice afterward that she was running the most effective small school in the hill country region. She thanked him politely and then submitted a formal request for better textbooks, which he approved before his wagon was out of the yard. She told Micah about it that evening and he said, "They should have approved it without needing you to ask." She said, "Yes, but they approved it." He said, "You are not satisfied with that." She said, "I am satisfied with the books. I am not satisfied with the system that requires me to ask." But the books are real and the system is slow, and in the meantime the children can read. He said, "You are the most practical person I have ever encountered." She said, "You say that as though it surprises you." He said, "It still does sometimes, in the best way." In 1884, their second child was born. A daughter this time, and Beatrice's labor was faster and the dawn did not have to come before Micah heard the second voice announce itself, high and clear, into the September morning. He held his daughter with the same reverence with which he had held his son 4 years before, and James, who was 4 and had been told very thoroughly by both his parents what was happening and why, came into the room and looked at his sister with an expression that was half suspicious and half fascinated, which was the appropriate response. They named her Clara Rose, the first name for Clara Sutton, who had moved to Careville the previous year to live with her sister after her children were grown enough, and who burst into full, unrestrained tears when Beatrice's letter reached her with the news. The middle name because Beatrice had always loved it, and because the rose bushes she had planted along the east side of the house were blooming when the baby arrived, and because it seemed right. James grew accustomed to his sister with a speed that impressed everyone. He appointed himself, with a 4-year-old's absolute certainty, her primary protector and explainer of things, and Beatrice watched him explain to Clara Rose, who was several months old and capable of hearing approximately none of it, how cattle were different from sheep, and why the south boundary creek mattered, and what the names of the stars were over the east ridge. She told Micah, and he stood in the doorway of the children's room listening to his son describe the Milky Way to an infant daughter, and the feeling in him was the same feeling he had felt carrying Beatrice across the pasture, that same opening, but now it was fully open, nothing partial about it, just the whole of him present and unguarded and glad. He did not look away. The Garrett situation had been resolved, the legal papers were signed and settled, and Garrett himself had moved to Oklahoma Territory in 1882, and his place had been bought by a family named Breckenridge who ran cattle like sensible people and kept their fences where they belonged. The property line on the west was peaceful and had been for years. The water easement agreement was still in the deed, recorded properly, a clean solution to a thing that had once seemed like it might become something uglier. Caleb, who was now in his mid-20s, had become the F's foreman, a position Micah had given him formally on his 22nd birthday, and which Caleb had accepted with the red-faced seriousness he brought to all significant occasions. He had also, in the spring of 1884, married Reuben's eldest daughter, Maria, which made the whole ranch family in ways that were informal and real and entirely consistent with the way the F had grown since Beatrice had arrived in it. Reuben himself had finally, in his 60s, conceded to the role of head cook, without the additional duties he had always added to it. And Dolers managed the kitchen with a competence that the whole ranch depended on. Their son, named for his father but called Little Reuben or simply Rube, had grown into a capable hand who had a particular gift with horses that Micah recognized and developed with the same attention he gave any real talent. The ranch was what Micah had spent 7 years making it, and what Beatrice had without ever intending to, just by being who she was made fuller. It was productive and honest and well run, and the people on it were cared for, and the land was managed with the particular long-view practicality that Micah had always brought to it, and that Beatrice had given a broader context to, because she thought in terms of what a thing would be in 20 years and he thought in terms of what it needed today, and together they covered all the ground between. He told her this once, late on a summer evening in the parlor, the fire lit not for warmth but for the light it made, and she was reading and he was looking at her instead of the accounts, and she looked up and caught him and said, "What?" he said. "I'm trying to figure out how to tell you something." She closed the book. She gave him her full attention, which was considerable. She said, "Then tell me." He said, "When I was young I thought that the measure of a life was what you built. The land, the cattle, the fences, the things that stood up, that was what my father taught me and what I believed." She said, "And now," he said, "and now I think that was right, but it was only half of it. The other half is who stands up alongside you, and the things you can be that you didn't know you were capable of when someone is there who sees them." He looked at his hands, the same hands that had wrapped her palm in a bandana in the grass of the western pasture. "I didn't know I had this in me, any of this, and you not because you changed me, because you showed me what was already there." She was quiet for a long time, and when she spoke her voice was softer than its usual steady clarity. She said, "You showed yourself, Micah. I was just there when you looked." He said, "You were the reason I looked." She said, "Then we helped each other see." He said, "Yes. That's the right word for it." She came to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned against him in the firelight, and they sat that way in the parlor of the Double F main house that he had built and she had made into a home, listening to the Texas night outside and the faint sound of their children asleep down the hall, and the world was settled and whole. James Ford, at 5, had begun to ride. Micah taught him with the same directness he brought to everything, but the patience that Beatrice had shown him was in the teaching now, fully integrated, so that when James made mistakes he was corrected clearly and without rancor and told to try again. And when he did well, he was told specifically why what he had done was good, which was something Micah had not been told as a child and had concluded, through years of watching Beatrice with her students, was an essential thing. James rode with his father by the time he was 6, along the fence lines and the creek path, and up to the limestone ridge, where the view went out for 20 miles over the hill country, and Micah told him about the land with a quiet passion that he had not known he felt until he heard himself talking about it to his son. He told James about the creek that ran silver in spring and dry in August, and about the plum thicket in bloom, and about the year the hailstorm had split the fence posts, and about how you judged the weather by the color of the western sky at 5 in the morning, and about the time a woman had walked through his fence and changed everything. James said at 6 with the literal-minded precision of a child who had inherited his mother's capacity for direct inquiry, "Was it Mama?" Micah said, "Yes." James said, "Did she hurt her hand?" Micah said, "How do you know about that?" James said, "She showed me the scar. She said a fence cut her and you fixed it." Micah said, "That's one way to tell it." James said, "How do you tell it?" He looked at his son on his small horse in the morning light and he said, "I tell it that I found her in the grass, and she needed carrying, and I carried her, and I didn't know I was capable of that kind of carrying until I was already doing it. And from there, everything else followed." James considered this with the seriousness of a 6-year-old receiving information he suspects is important. He said, "So she taught you?" Micah said, "We taught each other." James seemed satisfied with this. He turned his horse toward the ridge and said, "Can we ride to the top?" Micah said. "We can ride anywhere you want." They rode to the top, and the hill country was spread out below them in the early morning, all limestone and cedar and the silver thread of the creek through the valley. And Micah sat his horse beside his son, and felt the full, settled weight of a life that had turned out to be larger than he had known how to plan for, larger than he had thought himself capable of. And he was glad, genuinely, purely, simply glad, that a fence had been damaged, and a woman had walked through it, and he had found her in the grass. Clara Rose Ford, at 2, had her mother's hair and her father's gray eyes, and a temper that appeared to be entirely her own, fierce and brief, and soon forgotten. And she followed her brother everywhere with the confidence of a small person who has never once doubted her right to go wherever she chose. James, resigned to this, had adjusted his self-appointed protective duties to include his sister's expeditions into the yard and the kitchen garden, and the two of them together were such a constant presence in the daily life of the ranch that the hands had taken to calling them the Double F's other foremen, which Caleb found extremely funny and Micah pretended not to hear, and Beatrice thought was completely apt. In the fall of 1885, Beatrice expanded the subscription school further, taking on 2 older students who were preparing for a county examination that would certify them as teachers themselves, and she prepared them with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and both of them passed, and one of them, a young woman named Harriet, who had come from a family on the north side of Cutter's Creek that had 12 children and not enough land, went on to start a school in a community 30 miles to the east that had no teacher at all. Beatrice told Micah about Harriet's school opening, reading from Harriet's letter at the breakfast table, and Micah, who was across the table from her with James on one side and Clara Rose on the other and coffee he had already drunk 2 cups of because the morning had been an early one, said, "She learned from the best there is." Beatrice looked at him over the letter. She said, "You're practicing compliments." He said, "I've had 5 years of practice. I'm getting better." She said, "You are. You are genuinely getting better." James said, with 6-year-old's impeccable timing, "Papa told me the fence story again." Beatrice looked at Micah. Micah looked at his coffee. She said, "Did he?" James said, "He said you taught each other." Beatrice said, "That's right." James said, "He said he carried you." Beatrice said, "He did." James said, "Why did he carry you?" Micah said, "Because she was hurt and couldn't walk." James thought about this. He said, "I would carry you too, Mama." Beatrice said, "I know you would, my love." She looked at Micah across the table, over the children's heads, and there was in her look everything that did not need to be said, the 5 years, and the fire in the parlor, and the plum blossoms, and the hands that had known how to be gentle before he knew they knew, and the son and the daughter and the ranch and the school and the life they had built together between 2 people who had both come to Cutter's Creek looking for a clean start and found something better. He looked back at her. He said nothing, and he meant a great deal by it. She smiled slow and real, the smile he had learned to read as the one she did not perform for anyone, the one that was only for him. And she went back to Harriet's letter, and Clara Rose demanded more biscuit, and James announced that he had seen a hawk on the East Ridge this morning and wanted to know if hawks ate rabbits or only mice, and the table was full of noise and mourning and life, and Micah Ford sat at the head of it and felt the tenderness move through him, steady and sure. The way water moved in the creek when the spring came, and everything that had been dry and closed opened again. He had never once been tender with anything, and then a woman had walked through his fence and into his pasture and fallen in the grass, and he had carried her out of it, and his hands had known before his mind did that this was what he had been capable of all along. She had not given it to him. It had always been his. She had simply been the reason he reached for it, and in the reaching, everything had changed. The Double F ran well through the years that followed. The cattle were good and the grass held, and the creek ran silver in the springs that came as they always came, reliable and clean. Caleb raised 3 children of his own in the bungalow at the east end of the property, and Reuben and Dolores grew old gracefully and with dignity, and the kitchen was always warm, and the school room off the east wing of the main house produced student after student who could read and think and argue for what they believed was right. James Ford grew into a boy, and then a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and a quality all his own, a particular ease with people that neither parent had in full measure, that allowed him to walk into any situation and meet it without judgment. Clara Rose grew into a girl who was fiercer than either of them in the best possible sense, who learned to ride before she was 5 and to read at the same time, and who argued with her father on matters of cattle management at 8 years old, with an accuracy that he found embarrassing, and a passion he found admirable. Beatrice taught them both, as she had taught herself, as she had taught her students, as she had in some way that could not be precisely defined taught him, not by instruction alone but by being fully and consistently herself, present and attentive and honest and unafraid of what was difficult, and deeply, practically, completely committed to making whatever she touched better than she found it. He told her on an evening in 1888, after the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet and the parlor fire was burning low, that he thought of the day they had met, not the first time at the livery, but the real first time, the fence post on the cold morning, and he thought of who he had been on that morning and who he was on this one, and the distance between those two men was so great that he was not sure he could account for all of it. She said, "I can account for it." He said, "Can you?" She said, "You were already the man you are now. You were just keeping him at a distance because no one had shown you that being him was safe." He said, "And you showed me." She said, "You let me show you. That's the part that took courage. Not the tenderness, you always had the tenderness. The courage to let it be seen." He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. He said, "I'm glad the fence broke." She laughed, and the sound of it was the same as it had always been, full and real and unheld, and she leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, warm and certain, the way she had done 10,000 times in the years of their marriage, and in a way that still managed to catch him as something new every time, and she said, "I'm glad I walked through it." And they sat in the firelight of the house that he had built and she had made into home, in the good country of the Texas Hill Country in the year 1888, with 2 sleeping children down the hall and the whole life of the Double F settled and sound around them, and Micah Ford, who had never once been tender with anything, held his wife's scarred hand in both of his and understood that this was everything. This particular moment, this woman, this life that he had not planned and could not have imagined, that had arrived one July noon on a stage coach and changed every single true thing about him, not by taking away what he was, by showing him how much more of it there was.